What's up guys, it's River and today we're looking at the Canon EOS R. This is part of Canon's new mirrorless lineup, and while this camera has a complete physical redesign and many enhancements, there's still a lot of shortcomings. So the real question is, how does this camera stack up to the very popular DSLR lineup? How do the new revolutionary RF lenses stack up to the older lenses? And most importantly, if you're a professional, should you make the switch? So let's do a deep dive, figure out exactly what this camera does, exactly who it's for, and most importantly, is it right for you? Let's get into it. So let's jump right into the specs. This camera has a 30 megapixel full frame sensor with a Canon Digic 8 processor. Those may not be the most impressive specs on the market, but what really makes a Canon camera special is the image processing and the color science. So this camera has 14.2 stops of dynamic range, so everything out of this camera looks very cinematic. Plus, it has Canon's color science. If you don't know much about Canon color science, here's the tea. Canon colors are simply magical. The reds are nice and fiery, the blues are just the perfect shade of blue, and the greens are very well saturated. But most importantly, the skin tones are a highlight. Skin just looks really good on these cameras. Everybody seems to look attractive, and you're shooting a lot of fashion or people. This is definitely the camera you want to go with. So what about photos? This camera does 8 frames per second in single focus and 5 frames per second in continuous servo mode. And now you might be like, that's not very powerful, especially compared to the Canon 5D Mark IV. But this camera is really aimed at the portrait, fashion photography, lifestyle, and fine art market. And someone like that really doesn't need fast shooting speeds. Like, listen, this camera is not meant for sports, and they're not even trying to convince you to use this camera for sports. For something like that, I still recommend the 5D Mark IV or 1DX Mark II or 3 if you can afford it. Ultimately, this camera is not meant for action shots. But if you're in the realm of fashion, portraits, lifestyle, or fine art, where image processing, skin tones, and color science really matters. In fact, it's the most important thing. A camera like this will not let you down, and personally, when it comes to the actual image out of this camera, I do not have a single complaint. It is simply magnificent. In fact, I took some portraits of myself in very challenging lighting and some really heavy colored lighting to see what I could really do with these images, and I was really impressed. The skin tone always held up, and even if I shot a little overexposed or a little underexposed, I always felt like I had enough dynamic range and room to pull the image back to what I needed, or to really flatten out the image and really open up the shadows and really show off some of the highlights. I was really impressed with how much I could do with the raw processing in this camera. And the thing that impressed me the most, even though I shot most of these images at 800 ISO and 1000 ISO, the noise never got bad. The noise never got to a level where I was like, this is unusable. Everything looked like it was shot at a low ISO. When it comes to ISO and noise performance in this camera, I was super impressed. If you're a photographer, I really don't think there's anything about the image quality in this camera that will disappoint you. So let's talk about video, because when it comes to video, this camera is definitely a very peculiar character. As for frame rates, this camera does 24 all the way up to 60 frames per second in gorgeous Canon HD. It's super sampled, it's sharp, it's full of detail, and of course, the color science is just magnificent. With 4K, it's a bit disappointing. It does 24 and 30 frames per second, but it does a 1.8 times crop. It throws away most of the sensor, and honestly, we'll talk more about this later, but personally, I think the 4K, like a lot of Canon cameras, is just completely unusable. But the big advantage for this camera is the fact that it has C-Log built right in, and it was designed with C-Log in mind. The 5D Mark IV does have C-Log, but it was a later adjustment, and C-Log in 5D Mark IV is pretty noisy, plus that's only an 8-bit camera. The Canon R has a base of 10-bit color plus C-Log, and you get gorgeous high dynamic range images. Like literally, the video coming out of this camera looks as good as a C100 or a C200. I was super impressed with this. And I shot a few test videos using the C-Log and the standard profiles, and I was really impressed by how much I could push and pull these images. There's so much dynamic range. It looks super cinematic, and overall, when it comes to the image quality, I was really impressed. But now let's talk about some of the underwhelming specs. When it comes to the 4K, what it literally does, it throws away most of the sensor except for just 4,000 pixels in the middle. And that ends up cropping all of your lenses. And honestly, I think the 4K is unusable simply because it doesn't give you lens choices anymore. You no longer have access to wide lenses, and your your 24 becomes a 50. So if you're shooting 50mm close-ups on a 24, you're not going to get that flat, soft look that you want for a close-up. You're going to get the look of a wide lens. Personally, I think the 4K, like a lot of Canon cameras that crop in, it's totally unusable. And second, to get 10-bit color out of this camera, you need an external recorder. Also, this camera does do slow motion at 120 frames per second at 720p. That's gross. If you shoot 720p, we can't even be friends. So despite this being a very unfortunately under-spec'd camera, I still think it's a really, really good video camera. This camera has a ton of dynamic range. 14.5 stops is really impressive. I have a $40,000 RED camera, and that camera has 15 stops of dynamic range. It's really impressive to see 14 out of a DSLR that's under 2,000. And if you don't need 4K, you don't need a bunch of fancy slow-mo options, just the fact that it does gorgeous, gorgeous Canon HD that's super sampled, highly detailed with gorgeous Canon color science. If I was going to shoot fashion, if I was going to shoot short films, honestly, and I had to do it on DSLR, this would be the camera. Next, let's talk about autofocus. When it comes to Canon cameras, the autofocus is simply amazing. It's fast and reliable, and with the new mirrorless lineup, it's finally good in low light. When it comes to face and object tracking, this camera does a spectacular job, and because of the newer updates in the mirrorless style bodies, this camera is actually smoother and a little bit faster than the DSLRs. According to Canon, this camera can track objects even when underexposed by up to 6 stops, and honestly, they're not wrong. I was really impressed by how good this autofocus was, even in low light. When it comes to autofocus, yet again, there's really nothing I have to complain about. It's really fast, very reliable, and now it's good in low lights. Also, this camera has a feature in it called Dual Pixel RAW that captures images at a slightly different angle so you can actually change your focus in post. And you know what? It's a completely useless feature, ignore it. You will literally never use it. When it comes to stabilization, this camera has digital IS, which is software-based stabilization that's done right inside the camera, but it's not particularly good and it's nothing really that special. Canon tends to put all their stabilization into their lenses, but that can be a bit of a problem. For someone that does a lot of handheld work, a lot of run and gun work, I would definitely look into getting a Sony camera instead, because the Sony cameras have stabilization built right into the camera body, and it is very, very good stabilization. Next, let's talk about low light. So when it comes to low light, for photos, the thing is shockingly good. Now, Canon says it's good up to 40,000 ISO, but obviously you don't want to crank it that high. I found it was good at about 10,000, 12,800 ISO, but I probably wouldn't push it past that. After that, you're really losing a lot in the skin tones. But if you're shooting landscapes, don't worry about it. You can pretty much take all of that out in Lightroom. But when it comes to video, it's a whole different story. I find I got grain as early as 3200 ISO, but it wasn't ugly. There was no chromatic noise, where it's like it introduces a bunch of random colors. It all looked like cinematic filming grain. It was all dancing grain, as they call it. And I felt I could probably shoot this at up to 10,000 ISO without too many ugly problems. So it really depends what you're shooting. If you're shooting skin tone, you probably don't want noise in people's skin tones because it's just gonna make them look weird. I think if I'm shooting people, I'd be okay at 6400 ISO maximum, but if I'm shooting landscapes, I'd be okay with 10,000 ISO. I'm surprised to say this, but the Canon R is a pretty decent low light camera. It's not a Sony, but if a Sony's a 10, I would say this is an 8. So at the end of the day, can this camera vlog? Canon cameras are super popular for vlogging, and this camera is even better for vlogging. It's a small, compact, mirrorless body, so the body itself is really, really light. And I was shocked to see that even with the 24-105 lens, which is the biggest of the RF lenses, it's still light enough to vlog with. And I did do a little bit of vlogging, and I found it wasn't too tiring on my arms, and I don't have the biggest arms. And overall, it was a pretty convenient experience. And if I'm going to use a mirrorless camera to vlog, I'm definitely going to go with Canon. The color science is going to make you look very attractive. The autofocus is always going to keep you sharp, but it's a pretty expensive camera. If you're a super rich vlogger, go for it. Have a blast, buy a Lamborghini while you're at it. You know, maybe invite me. And last but not least, guys, let's look at design, because Canon has redesigned these cameras from the ground up. Unfortunately, it doesn't really feel like a Canon camera anymore. The ergonomics are still great, but I definitely feel like we've taken a step back, unfortunately. Because of the reduction in the overall real estate, we're definitely missing a lot of the buttons that I'm used to. For example, we no longer have a mode dial. There's actually a button that you hit, and then a mode dial menu comes up, and then you have to navigate through different modes in the menu. And personally, I find it's just that much slower. In older Canon bodies, you literally had a switch where you flip between photo and video mode. Unfortunately, you gotta hit mode, then hit info, and a bunch of other things. And it's just not as fast and efficient as the old Canon bodies. Despite being under spec, I always liked Canon cameras because I felt I was fast and efficient with them. But with this camera, I feel like I'm a little bit slower. However, this is a camera I'm mainly gonna use for studio and portraits and lifestyle stuff. And it's not the kind of stuff where I need to change my setting on the fly or I might miss a shot. I can really take my time. So being a little bit slower isn't the end of the world, but I definitely miss the old Canon style bodies. But I would still give this camera a 7 out of 10. I still feel like I can easily access the buttons that I need to. I like the fact that the record button is now on top. I just don't like having to go into the menus to change more important settings. The touchscreen is still there. I can easily and efficiently change all my settings from the quick menu. I would say it's like 7 out of 10. If 10 is a perfect Canon DSLR like the 5D Mark IV, this is 7 out of 10 there. But don't get me wrong, it's not all bad. I still really enjoy using this camera. The build quality of this camera is impeccable. It's magnesium alloy and I really feel like this is a super solid camera. I could travel with this, I could go on adventures with this, and this thing will not let me down. On top of that, we have that touchscreen that I love to use so much. I can still access all the menus, all the settings that I need to through the quick menu. We still have the classic Canon menus. I feel like I can easily set up this camera. I don't have to go through a million menus like I do with the Sony. But there are two major design changes that I have to talk about. Number one, we have this slide bar at the top where you can hit left or right on the bar or slide across to change different settings. And I'm sad to say, this thing is totally useless. It lets you change like the most random thing that you would never really need. Like if you hit left, you can go to 400 ISO. If you hit right, you can go to 800 ISO. I never really need to change my ISO like that. Like I don't even... Like the things that I wish this bar could do, it doesn't do. Like if I could hit left, go to real time, hit right and go to slow motion, that'd be amazing. But it doesn't let you, or it lets me change my volume on my audio. And like, I'm never gonna need to do that. The next thing that's changed with these lenses are the Canon RF lenses. And Canon was not boasting when they said these things were revolutionary. These lenses honestly look world apart from the L series lenses. One of the most interesting features that this lens has is the fact that it has a control ring and it can change a bunch of settings like aperture, ISO, white balance, and shutter speed. And this is super useful. It's really helpful to be able to look through my eyepiece and just change my ISO or white balance as I'm looking through. And it's just less time that I have to put looking into the camera and not focusing on my shot. I feel like I'm faster and slightly more efficient with this control ring, and I suppose I could say that whatever I lost in the back of the camera is made up for what this control ring does for me. And also, while we're talking about it, these lenses are amazing. I talked about this in my Canon RP video, but these lenses are completely redesigned and they're so much better. What they've actually done is the lens now sits directly on top of the camera, therefore they've removed the back optical block. Therefore, you need less glass, therefore you can use higher quality glass, and so you get a sharper glass, you get faster glass, and overall you get a crisper image. These new lenses look worlds apart from the L series glass. So at the end of the day, who is this camera really for? Well, it's definitely not for action or sports photographers. It simply does not go fast enough. It's definitely not for people who want to shoot 4K. You get this really crappy crop 4K. The people that I would really recommend this to is somebody that wants a full frame, 30 megapixel sensor, wants to shoot lifestyle work, portraits, product photography, something that doesn't require a lot of movement, and you want to do it with a mirrorless style body and you want to use the new RF lenses. If you're that kind of person, this camera would be perfect for you because the images out of this camera are gorgeous. And if you're a video shooter, if you're a cinematographer, if you're a travel photographer and you want to get gorgeous Canon HD, you want to get those Canon colors, but you also want a small compact camera that does C-Log, this is definitely the camera for you. There's a lot of other Canon cameras that do C-Log, but they're much bigger. So if you want to specifically get C-Log, but you want to get in a smaller body, this is a definite must-have. Lastly, if you're hyped on the RF lenses like I am, this is definitely a good camera to have. If you can't afford the R, maybe look into the RP. Personally, I think I'm going to be sticking to my RP, and I'll probably return the R. But if you can afford a little bit more, why not have a little bit more horsepower? But this is a really good way to get into the RF line. Overall, I think this is an incredible camera. It has 14 stops of dynamic range. It has C-Log, gorgeous Canon HD, gorgeous Canon colors, a 30 megapixel sensor. However, I think it's a bit pricey for what it's giving me, considering it has no 4K and it shoots pretty slow, and 10-bit color I need an external recorder for. I think I'm definitely going to recommend most of you guys pick up the Canon RP and maybe leave the R at home.